Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 30th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Circumstances which always attend the application of the means. The text follows. As there are certain circumstances which attend the combat throughout and have more or less influence upon its result, therefore, these must be taken into consideration in the application of the armed forces. These circumstances are the locality of the combat, the ground, the time of the day, and the weather. So, very short paragraph which sounds much like a statement substantially, but that nevertheless, and as always in the Vom Kriege, is actually very important, very poignant. As in here, von Clausewitz fundamentally lists all those factors that intervene constantly in war and that influence naturally the theory of the art of war as such, being in this sense the ground, the time of the day, and the weather. Right? These are protagonists of every combat situation and inform it in a way that can't be overlooked in any way. Right? And von Clausewitz will eventually explain in the next paragraphs how these actually operate and further actually because as you understand each one of them on their own on its own regard is fundamentally very variable, right? And we can say that these variables will be taken into consideration throughout all the book. So starting from the title very simply, circumstances which always attend the application of the means, right? So these are circumstances you can't absolutely not take out of the equation while you're employing your means, your armed forces. Always. And von Clausewitz writes, as there are certain circumstances which attend the combat throughout, all along, and have more or less influence upon its result, therefore these must be taken into consideration in the application of the armed force. So very, very simple, very clear, but also very undebatable, right, in this sense. And then he adds, these circumstances are the locality, combat, ground, time of the day, and the weather. So naturally we will, as we just said, take a look in detail at this, but since the text basically ends here, and for the sake of completion, and also actually for accessibility of the single topics, that I make a video per paragraph, right? So I feel the need, we maybe want to expand on this, like especially how this influence like the historian proper, right? Not much the commander, because I don't have any military experience in this regard, but I must say I do feel these elements particularly, and just like in the next, like in the last videos I made, actually, I pointed out that right now, this month, I'm studying battles, right? I'm reconstructing battles. This is the timeline I gave myself for January, and actually part of February, because I didn't make it in time, because it takes really a lot of time, a lot of concentration, especially, and there are just those hours of the day you can be concentrated for a decent amount of time. In my case, it's like ideally 8 hours, but I make it like 6, 7, and I quite never arrive to the 8. And just today, actually, and yesterday, I'm studying about a battle that was carried out it was from 14th century actually, and in conditions that were quite particular, right? The weather actually is taken out of the equation, so I don't know how that could help. Actually, well, the weather in this sense is meant by von Clausewitz as probably the atmospherical conditions, right? Not much the time of the day as such, but it's obvious that the two things in part are intertwined because they actually interact with one another, right? And they interfere also with ground, Mhm. But this battle is interesting because basically it was a great simulation of a maneuver that an army carried out because it hadn't been able to force a um, a ditch, basically a fortification. Actually, it was a palisade ditch to break through the enemy lines and actually reaching a fortress that was being besieged by the enemy in order to try to relieve it. Right. So what did this army? And what was interesting about in here was the ground, right? Because basically, there are two parallel river valleys, one of which is in fact the one along which on one bank of the river stood this fortification, and the guys from the other side of the river wanted to pass through. Right. So on the other valley was this fortification, and in the middle of these two valleys there was a ridge. All right, partly actually the location where this volume had been built. So it's very interesting because here, for example, it's all in the can say the mountains, but there are substantial reliefs. We're talking about hills, but even haven't calculated, but they're kind of 100 meters in starting from the river level at one point, and or maybe less, but things that were not actually influent to it. So and in the north of these rivers that substantially flowed towards the north, at one point begins the flatland, right? So this is very interesting because it was a fight between two cities that were, actually in the flatland and close to one another, right? And the interesting stuff was basically that the first army that wanted to break through the enemy lines simulated a march, carried out a march towards the north in the flatland, right? So basically, the enemy army moved in parallel towards that direction. So leaving a part of the ditch where the first army had already tried to break through unguarded, leaving actually, well, there was a garrison of 500 knights, seemingly. And it's very interesting that knights were, as an elite, this Western European 14th century were left, and this is very often at the guard of fortifications, right? There was obviously infantry as well, but seemingly the knights were still the most important element on foot, because they were picked troops objectively. So what these guys, the first army does, is that at one point the night comes. This was in the mid of November. And therefore, in the days were shorter, and at night, basically, this army came all the way back, and the point they had left, so to find that part of the ditch of the volume, the fortification, not guarded by the whole enemy army, and to break it through, they storm it, they assault it. And they managed to capture that. The garrison of 500 knights made some resistance. And in order to do that, they actually had to cross the bridge, probably actually the river, sorry. And they created a bridge, and the sources are kind of they are not all following the same pattern. I mean, of course, they're kind of consistent with one another, but there are a few details scattered here and there. And first of all, we don't know how they crossed the bridge. Once again, the bridge. They crossed the river, but they probably had either boats or maybe the river actually wasn't that. Crossing a river in November at night wasn't probably much of a good. So probably they laid certain pontoons or something. We don't know that. They storm this place and they make all the wagons with the weaponry and instruments pass. So just thinking at how this actually worked, right? Because the garrison that they attacked actually was on a spur over the valley, and it was actually, let me give a look at it because I think I haven't watched it on Google Streets, which is very interesting. see, and this makes you reflect on what, first of all, on what von Clausewitz just said, on the fact that, of course, this whole deal, right, this whole campaign that involved actually tens of thousands of men, right, considering both sides, 10,000 from the other, from one, and kind of more than 30,000 from the other, which are large numbers even for the 14th century, where things start moving a little bit more. Let me check, where is this? Here we go. So just think, you wonder, why are you talking about this now? Well, I'm talking about this now because I'm trying to find the same exact spot. Here we go. Yeah, and how this whole operation, this whole war. Here there's a beautiful picture of. I can't show you now because I don't want to tell you what I study, which stuff I'm studying. But actually, was a much. This is steeper than I thought. Actually, this is a much greater. So here you realize the terrain dictates everything. Right? You know, this is very, very, very important. I mean, the concept that this whole campaign is being developed around a terrain, right? So that this is not about going left, going right for no reason. This is literally nature presenting certain characteristics that cannot be ignored and that influence the whole logic of the of combat as well, right? We don't know actually much about combat proper. We know that eventually this battle was fought from the other side, like when this first army crossed the river and eventually passed the ridge. They arrived into this kind of valley. This was kind of a flatland a little bit, and they fought there because normally that's how you fight. And in fact, an amazing thing about these battles I'm studying is that they all look kind of similar, and that they were fought in places that look astonishingly similar, even if they are kind of scattered, here and there in range of hundreds of kilometers, right? And therefore you look at certain spots, and Google Streets is amazing here because this area is kind of well documented and it's full of pictures, etc. You can see a lot of details from there, and you see that there is a logic, for example, and this is important for the construction of the theory of the art of war that von Clausewitz talks about, between these battlefields. I mean, these battlefields have common features that eventually were chosen, not randomly, for the sake of fighting in there, right? For using cavalry in there and for actually making a real clash about it. So this is extremely important because it's as if there were common features in here that vary from battle to battle, but that at the same at the base kind of remain the same. So this makes you understand the importance of the terrain and how this influences the whole thing. These wall movements were done because there is a region here, there is a river. It's all very complicated to develop. I mean, you have to imagine the difficulties, the fatigue, the physical, intrinsic physical barriers that exist in this context, right? So you can't ignore them in any way, and you can't really say that terrain is the protagonist of combat. There is no way out of this, right? And everything, even when it's not an actual terrain, even if you talk about air warfare, that's still a particular type of terrain, like a situation that you can't take out of the equation. You have to know what aerodynamics is. If you want to build a plane to fight in the air, right? You must know what this terrain meant as ground as physical environment is, right? And it will all influence everything. And at the same time, if you want to hit to bomb the ground, well, that still influences everything, because you have to identify that on the ground. You're focused constantly on the ground. We use maps for making battle plans constantly, and that's our paradigm. We can't go without that, right? So this is what von Clausewitz is is trying to tell us, and this was just an example to make you understand what the whole deal was. But the time of the day as well, right? As we were saying before, the army wanted to break through actually makes this fake maneuver, and in which the enemies more or less fall into, like, because they don't realize immediately, they start pursuing them from the other valley in the same way, but they can't, like, they're not so speedy as the guys that had planned the whole thing. So, and with the favor of darkness, those guys, the first army manages to break through to defeat the enemy garrison, and therefore to do something that increases, for example, enormously, if anything from a visual point of view, the unknown factors. It's obvious that in the day, much more is known than in the night, by definition, right? It doesn't matter if you have night goggles and you can't see. It doesn't matter. Everything is more complicated. So the time of the day actually influences a big freaking deal. And actually what this campaign ended like is that the first army crossed, they reached that plain where they met with the other army and they fight, but it's very late. And therefore the first army manages to crush the second one and to win, and the second army retreats and whatever. So the first army was actually pretty good. They did a hell of a job in that situation, and they however the darkness falls again very soon. So actually this favors paradoxically those who are escaping, right? Because those troops those armies had met in a situation that couldn't be dealt with in other ways. Like, allegedly the second army was kind of surprised to find, of course, the first one that had crossed the previous night, the bridge and whatever, and the wall, the fortification. But they kind of decide to fight anyway, and they get crushed. But at the same time, that was all dictated by by another factor that was at that point for the first army to take the enemy by surprise, to make it quicker, even though the guys were exhausted, because actually both armies had made this like more than, I still have to calculate the whole march, how long it was, but we're talking about 30 kilometers per each in a day, right? Which was kind of the maximum that armies moved, like in the ancient world, in medieval world, and also like today, telling the truth, because unless you wanna it's not everything is not mechanized. That's what a human being normally does. Obviously can do more, but we're talking, the more people there are, the more this speed is decreased, of course. But normally there is this optimum that revolves around 30 kilometers in a day, and so that at 30 kilometers in a day, normally armies stopped and then fought the day after. Here it wasn't like that. Here the enemy was engaged, and we actually don't know whether the second army in particular was thinking, what the hell they were thinking, in the sense that sources, actually not sources, but we think that the victory was achieved here. I didn't explain it fully, but let's say the first army was more about cavalry, shock cavalry. The second one was, it kind of had it as well, but it had less and more infantrymen, and they were kind of difficult to, because they were citizen infantry, communal infantry, and they weren't quite of a professional level, as you understand, like the knights that were kind of mercenaries and professionals. So at that point, fighting, for example, at dusk, at sunset was a kind of was not a very good thing. Obviously the first army would have preferred to have reached the battlefield at another moment. And at that point, that's how much they had gotten, and it was already something that they had managed to take the enemy by surprise in the first place. So we don't know whether the Second Army kind of underestimated them or they were caught by surprise. We know that actually they accepted the fight, so it's likely that they also were confident. Still, also we don't know how much infantry was from the others. I mean, you see all the factors that we don't know, or what can really mess up the situation, but and make it for them, but at the same time also how much we don't know about it ourselves. But in this sense, for example, the fact that night fell probably was in the whole picture of the First Army actually a negative point, because they couldn't pursue the enemy and annihilate it completely. And also here the sources say one thing, some say that losses were just like 1,800, others said that the entire enemy army, like more than 30,000 people, got either killed or captured, which is an exaggeration. But I mean, just for saying that this is how we deal constantly in military affairs, and how this is not really different from an actual military experience from a cognitive point of view, or better from, in terms of trying to understand what is going on. Right, it's obvious that military men do it in a particular context, the civilians do it, military historians, let's say, do it in another, whether they're military or civilian, but essentially we're trying to do the same thing all the time, that is assessing what the hell is going on. And most of this interpretation is done through elements that you can't really ignore. And here, for example, the ground and the time of the day, as we've seen, are fundamental. We don't know anything about the weather, telling the truth, because sources do not state anything about that, unlike other battles in which I saw in a battle one day it snowed the whole day, the weather was horrible. We know it, but at the same time it kind of also depends. In fact, what effects this will actually make, because von Clausewitz at one point will talk about how the weather influences. And he says basically that a rain, for example, doesn't quite change much overall. Like, people could make a bit more extra fatigue, but it's basically virtually influent. When it starts snowing at the point you can't even see where you're going, well, that starts to be tougher, right? And that starts having an influence. But just for saying that you can get this sensitivity about literal sensitivity, because that's what it is. Because we don't know all the time what's going on, but exactly through the experience of confrontating, let's say, of comparing all these sources, this experience, we can get what normally happened, and let's say what is likely, what is not, and therefore not stopping considering every battle like something as radically different that can't be compared with others, but actually seeing a base of it, a structure to it, that you can compare profitably from a strictly historical point of view, which is what the same military needs, right, for assessing what is going on the field, literally. That helps you evaluating better what can go on, right? For example, fatigue. We don't know much about the fatigue that these armies were under, but it's obvious that we think in general that, considering the quality of the troops, where they came from, and therefore you should know the politics and the society and the history behind these communities, and maybe knowing something about the commanders, knowing about political ties. It's that based, it's that complicated, but at the same time there are certain essentials that need to be known, right? And this battle, for example, is quite interesting, because I'm studying these battles essentially to observe how, in a certain regional context in the 14th century, cavalry and infantry were kind of transforming, and in also relatively to each other fundamentally, because there is a decline of infantry, and of course an increase of cavalry, and so this battle, for example, didn't tell us very much about the whole deal, because actually the combat proper is not very documented, but we know from other elements, for example, numerical superiority of some elements, the fact that the garrison over the fortification, for example, was made up of knights, the fact that the army that got defeated was largely about infantry. The other guys had kind of tougher cavalry that had already come from another battle in which cavalry had been fundamental, but it was also mostly about a numerical superiority. We don't know much about equality. I mean, it all goes like that, and it's kind of dramatically difficult sometimes to come to a point where you say, well, okay, we can't be sure what we're saying, but that's exactly what comparing is important for, right? I'm citing these 12 battles essentially, and I've arrived at the 8 now, and it's the battles I studied before are dramatically useful. There are things that I know today now that I didn't know when I started studying the first battle, for which today I will have actually to go back a little bit on that and what I wrote about that battle, and starting to maybe taking away certain hypotheses I made because I think that are less likely now, and I can even skip those. So that's how you refine your perspective. That's how you go on and you increase your understanding of the world, right? And that's why up to this point on the Vom Kriege we have stuck to kind of the theoretical side of the story, which in von Clausewitz theoretical doesn't mean abstract. On the contrary, these are extremely concrete statements like the ones in this paragraph, but it's objectively true as well that you can't study the Vom Kriege by itself and just saying, okay, I accept it, but then I don't study military history and I can be a good use of it. Because actually von Clausewitz writes exactly to say people that study war for a reason or another, either because they have to find one or because they're interested in, because they, as we are, for example, but how you can frame certain information better and how certain data basically can be put together on the basis of these concepts, right? And that's because we don't know most of what we are observing all the time, right? Even if we had participated to that battle, probably not everything would have been so clear. This is the real deal that von Clausewitz makes, but clear in this point is that we are trying to make sense of things that largely, we can't say that do not do it, but that are difficult to make them do it, from our perspective, right? Because things always have their own logic though, and therefore we have to be able to read through that logic by, however, an ability that comes only when you are acquainted with actual samples of this. So it's interesting to talk about details and to see how they, and about this actual stories, episodes, and to clarify fundamentally what the value that what von Clausewitz writes in function of what you can discover in reality. That is what it is. In fact, if you're interested in battles, for example, I made a playlist that is about battles. I don't really upload much content compared to others because I don't know why. It's possibly because the stuff I use when I want to talk about something do not concentrate primarily on them, and also because they are kind of difficult. Well, 14 videos, right? And they're mostly, I think, they're all about ancient and medieval world. And if you listen to them all, for example, you can start immediately understanding that there is something in common to them. Even if we're talking about battles that maybe are separated from by 1,000 years, but technology was substantially still the same, and still war was still the same beyond history, right? And therefore there are certain dynamics that always recur, and this is what von Clausewitz here is trying to make us reflect on, that these factors that are kind of the most elementary: combat, the ground, the terrain. You can't exclude terrain by definition. You can't exclude the time of the day, what this includes, and you can't exclude the weather. These are always there. There is not a single type of combat in which this is not true. These always interfere, right? The weather at that point, even if those sources, for example, we couldn't really, they didn't really tell anything about it, but we can immediately guess, I don't know, from studying the climate of that region, that of course in 700 years didn't change substantially, what it could be like, and how this could influence, for example, like just think about temperature, average temperature, how this increases in terms of the needs of feeding the army, especially at night in November. I mean, as we were saying before, that requires surely much more energy than it requires at night in July. But it's pretty obvious, right? And these are things, for example, that we already know and that we can use to say, okay, we don't actually, there is not a source, there is not a firm evidence about that, because I don't know, maybe that day in mid-November was totally crazy. It was like more like May in weather. We don't know. It's still possible, but it's very likely that it wasn't the case, and that this was a kind of typical November day, and that presumably this influenced the situation toward a certain direction. And maybe you can't do really anything with that. In fact, for this battle, I'm not really pointing that out, because we don't have any source saying anything meaningful to it. So I kind of leave to the reader the realization that, of course, even the fact it was November had some impact overall in the northern hemisphere, that latitude and whatever. So it's kind of interesting, because it all should, I mean, the mindset of the historian or the commander, all these factors obviously interplay, right? But we don't know in which measure. So you can understand in here why, from Clausewitz, you can't you can't have a positive theory of the art of war, because this would make you pretend to say things like, okay, let's take the average November temperature and let's presume that this is exactly what it was that day, and let's calculate all the calories now that soldiers lost in this particular context, and let's make hypotheses about which path they took exactly and how that road was exactly, to calculate what exactly at the end of the day. We don't know. The variables are so wide, and they interfere with each other so much that that doesn't make sense. But you can make a synthesis of it, and considering the whole picture, and therefore eventually expressing an historical judgment on the outcome of this battle that included, maybe even just in your mind, and aside from the influence that the evidence, that you started, that you pointed out in the sources, with the quotes, etc., that made you come to that point, to that conclusion, right? And yeah, and here, for example, it's how many pages of word? It's not really much. It's just 36 notes, and yeah, they're pretty hefty, but come on. You can make in fact, it's also important to make a synthesis. Like, I still have to finish it. I don't know whether this night I will manage to finish it, because I work up to 4 a.m. usually, and so I have kind of some hour left. But the concept is most obviously that we have some evidence that we can't truly see, which is an oxymoron, because the evidence is what you can visualize, in fact, etymologically speaking, but the evidence is also something that you can have without really having a source. And this is very important historically speaking, right? Because von Clausewitz in this context is a very pragmatic person. When you meet someone that tells you, there is no evidence for this, and hence we can't say anything about it, well, this is really not true. I mean, it's obvious that it remains at a hypothetical level, but there are, of course, hypotheses that are kind of much sounder than others, right? So it's obvious that there are things in history that you should always that in history possibly you should support, but you can't explain literally every single thing in this context. Like everything you write, for example, just from a linguistical point of view, banally and not banally, is something that you give for granted when you're addressing a certain audience. This is very important, right? You even what you see, what I do in my videos is that I don't literally explain every single thing I say. Like I give for granted, also because I don't have time, that I can't speak about things without quoting the source for everything, and you're okay with that, and that's essentially what also happens most of all the historical channels out there, because if I started to tell you this battle by all the various notes here that I took, the now hundreds of quotes that I've inserted, you start. I mean, it would be much more boring than it already is, right? But at the same time, that's something I had to take into consideration. And even if there's a typing mistake, and I'm just looking at it while I was speaking here, but now I close it, and the. You understand what I mean, right? I don't need to explain you certain things for you to understand them, and this can be tricky as well. Like even this structure, this common features that normally these battles have, it doesn't mean that necessarily every battle has them. Actually, every battle differs, in a way, and it will always be. This is not something statistical. It kind of you can be sure that it's always like that. The problem is kind of assessing by how, and that's why we don't know, and that's why we have to use talent and something more, that is this sensitivity that you can't get unless you start to really study battle after battle from the sources, reflecting on them, spending entire days on them. That's what we do. That's how the whole thing is done. And as you understand it here, it's actually dramatically simple. I mean, it's complicated. It can get complicated when you get, 50 sources, and then but the concept in itself is not. Like the modus operandi is not, right? It's the reality that is complicated, but the concept that is not, and this is what von Clausewitz is telling us, that we don't have to get lost into the fact that the reality is complicated. It's thanks to my eyes that the reality is complicated, but fortunately enough, we have certain synthesis capacity of our mind that are utterly exceptional, that help us dealing with information by kind of making sense of it, even if we don't know 100% what the hell is going on most of the times. And actually, we know actually way less than that, right? And for example, I'm writing this battle. There's a lot about these battles, and there are other problems that come to my problem. I mean, I have, for example, to stop at one point. I said that this is a whole chapter, right, about the same this 12 battles of my thesis, and the concept here is that obviously it has to be a synthesis, because for each of these battles there are books written in, right? And what I'm doing here is kind of a synthesis that is aimed at highlighting, in fact, this kind of evolution of this transformation, the cavalry infantry interaction, let's say, racial relation, whatever you want to call it. And of course, I cannot expand for every single quote I make on all the various hypotheses that this stuff can come to mean. Sources, for example, contradict each other. And at that point, I simply state that, okay, that source says that thing and the source says that other thing, but this still doesn't, and this is usually what I do, either if it's a particularly important incongruence, I say it in the text, but most of the rest that is kind of superficial, I say it in the note. And what really matters of all this historical work is kind of the synthesis I make, in which you can measure my own judgment. That can be completely, I might have, it could be all wrong. Let's say I might have gotten all it wrong, but I supported it at least with the sources and with the evidence that I have. So it's kind of difficult. Like, this is something I often say. For example, I spent like 1 year studying a single campaign of course, I've been doing something else in the meanwhile, but that was for my master thesis, and I mean, it took me 1 year. And why though? It's because I started. I mean, my thesis was exclusively about that campaign and that battle. So I said, since it wasn't like, it's not that I discovered this battle for the first time, but objectively in my country and also abroad, and from the same countries where this place actually happened, there wasn't a terrible amount of information about it. A lot of studies written about it. So I wrote it on my own. It was very funny, but I took into consideration basically everything from the historical background, the life of the commanders, and you can, and those are the works that really make a sensible difference, right? I'm skipping here the whole thing because I'm extrapolating these battles from their largely, I mean, not from their context in the sense, of course, for example, when I make their construction, this essentially tactical episodes, I still need to talk about the strategic context, because otherwise they wouldn't make sense. But I'm not concentrated on it. I'm just looking at a particularly narrow thing that is objectively narrow, in part because it can be measured in great part actually on what happens on the field, strictly tactically speaking, from the clash, the combat. But when you make instead a great consideration about the whole thing, like I'm actually doing right now in this thesis that is enormous. At this point I'm at the second chapter, and it's over 500 pages, and I which is definitely too much, right? But I need to quote, because mostly it's notes, telling the truth. The text is not even enormous. It's the notes that need to back the text up, because otherwise you don't explain people why you say what you said. Instead, you have to be completely transparent. This is what theoretically at least a good historian should do. Like, you can't have maybe your judgment sucks, but if you do things right, in terms of quoting and in evidencing, you're substantiating your evidence. Let's say you've done your job. You can get your title, right? So the point here is that I'm collecting this whole amount of information, because the second chapter, for example, was just about this major 12 pitch battles that are also in this 14th century context, kind of, this is normal for more or less for medieval Europe. What they like, they're the only clashes that can be reconstructed tactically speaking. Like, for other combat that is present, scattered here and there, many battles, we don't know much. We know that there were battles, we're also pretty big, but we basically don't know a freaking damn what the hell happened on the field. These are the 12 battles that we can study decently, kind of reconstructing the whole clash. And this is just one chapter. Like, there are other chapters that deal with other combats. And the whole idea is putting all this stuff together and kind of measuring, the like a thermometer, how active, how effective cavalry was, how infantry was, and all what this implicates. Who were these guys? Were they citizens? Were they mercenaries? Were they foreigners? Were crossbowmen, infantrymen, light cavalry, heavy cavalry? There is an enormous amount of stuff to do, and the concept here is that there is a Clausewitzian one. The more you compare, right, and the more you learn, like the more you get from this stuff. So this is what has literally the precedence when you want to understand specifically the art of warfare as such, right? I could have studied war, for example, just from a organizational point of view. Well, at that point I would have probably fallen also into the art of warfare, depending on what I would have dealt with. But for example, if you just study, I don't know, war in the sense how much did the city-state paid that merchant to, for that set of swords, well, that's not a big deal. Like, unless you that's not really much about the art of warfare as such. You're not using your armed forces at that point. Yeah, you're putting them together, but that's, as we've seen in von Clausewitz in previous videos, that's another thing, right? So at that point, that would be military history, but not the history of the art of war. This is, strictly speaking, the evolution of tactics, armies, armaments, and how they were employed on the field, and most of the situation you can observe in this sense is the evidence you can see here is from combat proper. So everything is kind of more complicated than it seems, telling the truth, and this was just an example to make you see how in this research that technically doesn't care much about the ground, like this is not a, there's not even a single paragraph that I dedicate to the ground as such. Like there is a paragraph I dedicate, for example, to the ground in function, for example, the use of heavy cavalry, whether it was, there are situations in which, but that's not about the ground much in itself. It's mostly about fortifications, field fortifications. I mean, and so it's very, but the ground, however, the terrain in this sense is always there, and basically, even if I don't deal with it, I deal with it forcefully to understand what is going on in the field. So this is what the core concept of this paragraph is saying that the ground, the time of the day, and the weather can never be excluded at any time, even if you pretend that the determining factor, I mean the most important factor of a battle that is going to determine a battle is one. Probably you haven't understood much about von Clausewitz, but let's say that objectively there are certain factors that are at least more important than others, then you can focus more on them. But you can't avoid, by any standard, to ignore things like ground, time of the day, and weather. This is what von Clausewitz told us. And we will be observing this also later with a kind of more of a tension. And this is fundamentally what I wanted to talk with you about today. But let's say it's fun in the sense that I don't know. I could expand on another digression when I used to make tactical games, because I was in love with certain tactical games war games that I had seen. Tactical games. Let's say, but they were war games, proper in the sense that they were both about strategy and tactics. So maybe it's not technically tactical, but what I was talking about is that I started making maps and creating these games on my own. I even thought about doing this in Schwerpunkt, which basically consists in creating a map, in fact. I mean, it's literally the first thing. What do you want to do about a war game? Creating a map. Because you can't do it otherwise, right? You can't do it otherwise. Where do soldiers move, right? And these are not conventional war games like board games. There's nothing to do with that. These are more like exercises you could find in military academies about, where to get and what's by. And there are really great, extremely tough games. I mean, the solution is not clear, but the first thing you have to care about when you prepare them is the terrain. Because, for example, I used a certain terrain maps generator because objectively, those are kind of cool. You can find them online. And that was interesting because I said, oh wow, now so every battlefield will present me with the same level of complication. Well, actually not. I had to these were random maps generators, and sometimes I had to generate 2 or 3 maps before I could find one that didn't force me, for example, to make the war game, so this battle with 2 armies that were moving in this space, too obvious. I mean, the terrain conditions the whole thing so heavily that even if you kind of invent like so many different solutions by using, I don't know, more units, scattering them on the field, etc., still the field makes you realize that it's kind of obvious what a certain tactical situation is. Naturally, these are kind of simple games like that do not take into consideration many factors, and that's why they're not actual simulators. I didn't intended them to be at all as combat simulators from that point of view, but just making people reflect, for example, on the value of terrain, things like terrain, and you can simulate at that point, for example, the weather, but you can kind of understand how that can be the same were to do it, for example, with a video game. There are many video games that were actually created as military simulators, and you can see from there how the problem really is, because you're experiencing it in the same exact way you do in reality, in part. Like, at least the concept that, if it's dark you can't see. Well, that's so elementary if you think about it, and that's exactly why you can't take it out of the equation. So I'm very positive about the the ultimate result of it. And I don't know, maybe one day I will present it to you, but I used to present this stuff to a guy that had actually studied this kind of games and solutions, that had a very good eye for them. And I never talked to you about them, but it's not a big deal, because after all, we all have our fields of expertise in part. So this one was a kind of a mentor for me, and it was so funny to make these maps and to like give it to someone for seeing them. But I could do the same thing on Schwerpunkt, and I think it would be very, very interesting to discuss it, to have a kind of fun with them, right? I think it could be entertaining, because everybody seems to have a different opinion. The first thing is, and that's the tragic side of the story, which actually is not very good at all, because these games actually have only one solution. Let's say one best solution, right? And one that kind of appears to be the most definitive in some way, and that is based on actual military assessment, realistic military assessments. And I remember that I presented these games once to a wide pool of audience that was disciplined by this mentor of us. And I remember that there were people who completely missed the point of the whole game. Like, that's a problem. Like, the concept even of time, of, that makes you understand that people are really fixated with certain material objects that really have instinctively this incapacity of focusing something that goes beyond a positive theory of the art of war, and that actually is what von Clausewitz demonstrated and showed us. That is to say, I remember was a guy who started saying, I don't remember, because in this game there was even the hour, and this was meant to be probably actually thinking exactly about the time of the day, because obviously with the darkness everything was kind of easy. It depends. It can be easier for someone that is to hide, for example, for someone not to because they can't see at that point. And I remember there was one guy that answered something like, it was like 8 p.m. in this game, and his guy wrote, well, okay, the first thing I do is taking half an hour for dinner. Like, and it was so funny, because this mentor answered like, oh, well, okay, and this guy actually, no, because the mentor said something like, are you kidding, right? And the guy said, no, and this matter were, okay, so you were not kidding. Well, okay, you've already lost, because that half an hour is precious in this situation. You're doing nothing. You leave the initiative to the enemy. You're done with. And these games are amazing, because they kind of make you feel, what really, first of all, how these factors are ineliminable. Like, what I would like to make you understand about this specific paragraph is that, and also we'll continue in the following ones, is that it's not that terrain has an impact that you can say, well, okay, this is just one of the factors. Like, it's of course it's one of the factors, but it's really a major one that dictates most of all what the other factors are gonna be. And we have seen it with example that I told you about before, about the thing I'm looking at. So right? Currently, in that with that battle, that campaign. So the interesting thing, in my opinion, is to stress how powerful certain decisions are. Because if you were to literally command those units on the field, I mean, you would actually make people die because you're so dumb that you're so irresponsible. Of course, no, you would never get to that point. That, like in the case of that guy, you say, okay, let's take half an hour for dinner. Like, what? And that's what I think. I mean, I'm not of course saying that. I mean, people are stupid just because they make some mistake. But I mean, given that, given what that particular context was in when I submitted this game, and what the aims overall was, it was a military themed situation. Why would you even say something like that? And the guy was actually serious about it. Like, said, okay, but these guys need to eat. Well, okay, but how do you think war works? I mean, like, they sit at a table in the mid of the battle, they have dinner, then they order, like, before they order they're choosing a menu. Like, how do you see that? Like, it's a situation where the enemy is swarming from all sides, right? So that's exactly the concept of the tragic realization, because this is actually not funny. So, I mean, it's not so funny because it makes you realize how actually the people were competent in certain moments of emergency, how few they are, really, and how, of course, a commander in the field would have never said something like that, because obviously this guy maybe hadn't met these games for the first time, he didn't know, well, he didn't care, maybe he liked military history but never thought about certain things. But for saying that, at one point it's like a great problem solver, right? Solving, actually, it's this fact that you're obliged to take action in a way for which, if you make the wrong move, you die, right? We have already talked about this in the broader implications. Like, think about chess. There are many people who actually think that chess is kind of, if you play chess, you become smart even in warfare because it's all about strategy. No, chess has literally nothing to do with the art of war, and not even by the slightest, because it's a deterministic game. War is not like that, but at the same time, there are certain choices that kind of make more sense at the same time. The problem is that and you have to follow them if you want to remain alive from the first step. Now, the problem is that while you take that first step, the situation has already changed. So that's what you have to cope with, and this is in a nutshell what, also you don't just need to study from Clausewitz, that is obviously the greatest authority in this field, but just study the theory of games. Like, this is what reality is about. Concretely, it's not just about war, it's really about life and how we undertake it. So it's a much wider problem than it actually seems, right? And these games would be amazing, because if I grow enough as a community on Schwerpunkt and I start making these games, I mean, people would start producing the stuff, maybe, I don't know, on their own. It would be so funny just to play in them and to solve them, right? And it would be complicated. Like, I personally think that I don't know how it would evolve, because most of these games, I think I set them like in the 19th century, like maybe 70s, the 60s of the 19th century. But I would like to expand maybe on other times, because it's worth to, and that's also where it grows complicated, telling the truth, because if I started to do it, I tried to do them at some point with even World War II, divisions and stuff. It was kind of a bit more complicated, also because the funny aspect of it is, like, the games I made were all kind of symmetric in the sense that the armies were kind of the same. If you want to make it historical, it starts becoming a bit more complicated, because you should actually go look at how certain units were organized. There were substantial differences, and especially if people are not acquainted to them, if you don't know how they functioned on the field, well, that can start to become difficult. Like, this is why I think an 18th or 19th century warfare is kind of more intuitive. At least for me, it's always been like that. I think the 18th century and 19th century are extremely intuitive from a tactical point of view, right? But just for saying that there is room for doing a lot of funny stuff, and all thanks to warfare. That it's paradoxical, but war games are a really important part of the strategical as well as tactical decisional process, and that's how the same military is trained, right? It's how the same commanders are trained, and this could open so many other digressions about the operational art, all the historiographical debates that happen about it, at which levels we can start talking about something like an operational art, how it's applicable. This is why the room for what we can speak in here is actually infinite. Like I took at this point just more strictly historical, and also kind of not just military historical, in fact character, because I think it's important as well. But this stuff is actually very interesting if we were to get into it, but it takes time, it takes a lot of planning, and it's not easy. Okay, for now let's stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.